This is Commissioner Fielder. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. All right, welcome all. We will proceed with this informational meeting. I am delighted to have with us today to make the presentation Mr. Paul Susky, who is Executive Vice President for Regulatory Policy and General Counsel with SPP. We also have with us remotely Commissioners Fielder and O'Donnell, and I will fall back to my old county agent 4-H club meeting days and go to the back of the room and have those attendees introduce themselves, if they would. Brooke, start with you. Oh, and Commission Secretary over there. And our IT guru, Philip English, who we're very dependent on days like this. So we are going to proceed in this manner. We'll have SPP make their presentation, and then we will open the floor for questions. If you're in the room, just raise your hand and we'll get to you. If you're zooming in, there is a Q&A box set up. We'd ask that you go ahead and submit your questions there, and then Philip will get those to me and we'll address those. We've got another analyst that just joined us, Mr. Templeton. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Just by way of very brief background, some weeks ago, the California ISO came before us to talk about what they were proposing for an enhanced day-ahead market for the Western region. I think it is safe to say that the concept of developing access to some iteration of an organized market in Montana is very important to utilities in this state going forward. SPP is an RTO based out of Little Rock, Arkansas. Also is offering for the region the prospect of participation in a day-ahead market, and that's what we'll be talking about today. The title, I think, for your endeavor is Markets Plus, as opposed to EDAM for the Cal ISO entity. So with that, we're going to be very informal. I will over to Mr. Susky.
Thank you, Commissioner Johnson. I share with you a number of items. Before I get started with the slides, On the phone from Wyoming is Kara Ford. Kara, do you care to introduce yourselves and tell a bit about what your role is at SPP?
Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. Paul, just to tell you, you're kind of in and out on the mic, so I'm not exactly sure what you've asked me to do. I think it was to introduce myself, so I'll do that. Kara Forns, Director of State Regulatory Policy for SPP. Before I joined SPP about 18 months ago, I was a commissioner at the Wyoming Commission. Before that, I spent my career in the law, focusing on water issues in the West, mostly in Wyoming, but other areas in the West. I continue to reside in Wyoming because I spend most of my time on our Western Energy Services. So great to be with all of you today. Look forward to our presentation and our discussion. Thank you.
And I'm Lee Elliott, Senior Analyst with the SPP Regulatory Group, reporting up through Paul. My role currently is, and we'll talk about a little bit in here, supporting the RSC, which is our Regional State Committee, as well as the Cost Allocation Working Group, and continuing to work on that side. I've started to move over a little bit and helping in the West, and so look forward to being here today with y'all.
All right. So how we're going to proceed is we're going to start out giving a little bit of background about SPP, the RTO, and then we're going to talk about some of the services we currently provide in the West. A lot of folks do not know about the scale and the scope of what we currently provide in the West. So we're going to talk about that a bit. And then we're going to transition to the efforts of an offering we are offering for the West called Markets Plus. Kara's going to do a deep dive into the governance of what we're looking at, and love to answer questions either at the end or if people if you have questions during the presentation, whatever works best. So again, introduction to SPP, talk about.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Yes, it seems like the mics aren't working very well, so I think folks need to really speak close to them because the sound, the audio is not consistent.
If I switch mics, is that better? Switch mics. Oh. So, Kara, can you hear me okay?
That's much better.
All right, I did switch microphones. All right. Well, unless I hear otherwise more difficulty, I will proceed. This is our mission statement and our vision. First of all, our mission statement is help and economically keep the light today and in the future. A big part of what we do as an RTO, we operate a day-ahead energy market. And we also do planning as we look into the future, just an opportunity we have. And also we want to be leading our nation to better and brighter and deliver the most value. One of the key components of an energy market is to deliver the lowest cost power to end-use consumers in a reliable manner. This is in 2004, when it actually was limited to Kansas southward on that map. In 2008, Nebraska joined, and in 2015, the Dakotas and parts of Iowa, Montana, and Minnesota joined. So this is the membership of SPP. One thing that is very different from stakeholder process. Many changes to our tariff policies, procedures actually have a voting structure. I would say it's very similar to a state legislature. We have committees that can propose changes to our governance structure. From the committee, it goes to a full body of known as our Markets and Operations Policy Committee, where it's one member, one vote. And from there, it goes to a members committee, which is a representative body of about 20 members, and then it goes to our board of directors. And then upon any approval of policies, most significant policies requiring a filing with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So this is a key differentiator from us of other RTOs. Very much like a cooperative structure, if you want to relate to the industry. And this gives you the idea of the membership. Very diverse membership, very broad, and you'll see the last listing of a member as federal agency, and that is WAPA. And WAPA has a big presence, as you know, in Montana. This is our energy production, and as you can see, coal is the number one fuel source for our fleet. Wind, and I'll talk about the history of wind. Wind is our number. Is hydro, and you can see we currently have very little solar, but we are seeing more solar coming on. So now I'm going to talk about kind of what we're doing on the planning sides and the planning for the future. So when we became an RTO in 2004, important things we had. So one of the things we did, and I'll talk about the regional state. One of the concepts was when we build out transmission, one of the biggest challenges of it is who pays for it and how do you allocate those costs. When SPP became an RTO, the decision was made to create a regional state committee, and the state committee actually decides the cost allocation for transmission. And so as a part of that authority, the RSC would set policies of how we allocate cost. The RTO then would plan for transmission to be built. And then this here shows you the amount of transmission through our region that has been put into service over the years. And so the yellow shows what's complete. I imagine the 2021 blue box probably should now be yellow, a little bit dated slide, but you see the amount of investment. If you really see, the peak was around 2014, because at the time as a region, the region was moving to help get the transmission built, because that's when we launched our day-ahead energy market. And as a result, this transmission build out allowed the flow of power from across the region that helps reduce prices to end-use customers, but also do it in a reliable manner. I will say I'm not going to speak about the winter weather event in February 2021, but this transmission that you see on this graph that was put into service saved the day. We would have been in a much more difficult situation. So utilities in the north were able to generate electricity. Utilities in the south, primarily because of gas supply issues, could not generate. And but for this transmission enabled the power in the north to shift to the south of the footprint, but it also allowed us to import power from MISO, which is to our east. Interesting note, talking about power in that event, we imported from Colorado and Canada as a part of that, because transmission is such an enabler. So what SPP does today is highly dependent on our ability to move power, and this is the build out. And I emphasize again, who pays for this transmission is decided by the states. And I'll get to that here in a second. And part of really the biggest driver here, I'd say for SPP, is you'll see the loan vote by the green line. That is primarily driven most of our states, and our utilities in our states had a goal to have renewables. I know Montana at one point had a renewable portfolio standard. Most of our states have the same, and the goals were anywhere from 15 to say 25, 30%. And so part of the need was, how do we, as a region, help meet those goals? And so then as a result, the utilities invested in wind. We were able to get those on the system, tie it to the transmission build out, and you can see we had a transition. And what you see here is the green bar shows how it's moved. So it kind of points them out. Interesting. Because a lot of people ask, well, why did gas drop from 2020 to 2021 in the yellow bar? Because the price of gas has gone up. And so when the price of gas goes up, coal clears the market, and therefore you can see the increase of coal. Currently, our projections are in 2022, wind will be the #1 generating source. We still obviously have a few months to go in the year, but that is our current expectations. And primarily, again, this was driven by state policies for RPSs and obviously federal incentives from the federal production tax credits. So now I want to talk about our this slide here shows in the yellow light what's being built directly out there in the west. But the red is our two-way footprint, and then the yellow is where we offer some type of services for the Western Indian. Sometimes it's interesting, people think we are headquartered in Arkansas, and some people think, oh, well, the board members are from Little Rock. Actually, the only board member from Little Rock is our CEO. SPP actually, historically, we've only had one board member in our footprint. These are board members independently selected by the membership, as you can see from the dot stars on the map located all across the country. I do have two current members familiar with the West, Mark Crisson and John Caparo. John is retired, lives down in Southern California. He ran Tacoma for a number of years and was a longtime president of American Public Power Association. And John Caparo worked for the various utilities in the West and has a long career in the industry. Of our board members, and here's a picture of our board members. Interesting backgrounds. I would say 3 come from the utility industry, 3 come from so very diverse background, a lot of engagement and expert. I'm going to talk about governance of a regional state committee and turn it over to you to talk about the RSC. But as I mentioned earlier, the RSC, when we were formed, they created a regional state committee, and that 4 the country that has this construct. And so when they make a decision on a it's an incredible history, 18 years of success. We actually even have a book that documents all of the times they adopted a policy. We have a link to the meeting minutes where they did, and Research approved them. So a great group. Each state gets 1 vote, regardless of size, equal voting. And so they were strongly supported by the cost allocation working group. I'm going to ask Lee to share about the cost allocation working group.
As Paul mentioned, we talk about the RSC being made up of commissioners of each state. As you commissioners well know, that a great support staff helps with that. We have the cost allocation working group, which meets monthly to review different items that fall underneath the purview of the regional state committee. It's made up of one staff person from each commission that's represented on the RSC. And their role is to help look at policies, review tariff language that falls underneath the 4 authorities that Paul will be talking about in a second, and really helps to make sure that our RSC functions proactively and is aware of the issues as we bring them forward to them. Currently today, the cost allocation working group chairs are based upon whoever the president Commission. Next year, it will be Sherry Albrecht out of the Kansas Commission, as the leadership at the RSC changes every year based upon the vice chair and secretary, as most organizations work that way. But once again, the cost allocation group meets monthly and works through those policies in order to support the commissioners of their various states.
All right, now we'll go to the next slide. Now, this is the RSC's authorities. There are 3 areas that they have authority on. First is cost allocation for transmission asset. is financial FTRs, financial transmission rights. That's your right. The transmission system, when you go into a market, that changes. But take it down to RSC, and also resource adequacy. This is a big change. Resource adequacy have not been an issue in the footprint. Like the rest of the region, it's becoming more of an issue. And RSC recently, as last month, adopted 2 new policies. So you see these are the 4 authorities. Then if you look on the far right, that's how many times they've used their authorities. So if you take a look at 12 times they've adopted policies related to cost allocation, 3 times financial rights, planning. As I said, each time we update our planning process, they have to approve it, and then resource adequacy. Interesting, last month, this will tell you the authority of RSC. Last month, the membership, we had a vote on increasing the resource requirements in our footprint. The membership voted 95% to 5% to delay it a year and phase it in. The RSC voted unanimously to put it effective immediately as in next year. So you had a difference of opinion, and then because of our governance, they're a primary authority, and as a result, the RSC's policy was adopted. So this is a great history of the RSC. The commissioners probably ought to know many of the members of the RSC, and they're always a good resource to learn more about that. So at this point, I was thinking before we transition to other services in the West, the commissioner would be okay to ask if there's any questions, or do you have any questions?
Absolutely, Paul. Commissioner O'Donnell, have you got any questions at this stage? Take that as a no. Commissioner Fielder, have you got any questions?
No, I don't. Thank you. It just the audio is still a little bit problematic. So I think if they can keep the mic as close as possible, it might help.
We will do that. Thank you. Anyone in the audience have questions at this point? Actually, I do have a couple of quick ones. Your footprint in Montana, what's the nature of the SPP operation in that part of your footprint? What are y'all doing?
So in the RTO, so we plan for the transmission grid for the utilities that are under the RTO. We dispatch generation in the day-ahead market. So in the day-ahead, they state this is the amount of load that I need to be served by the market. They also say this is the generation I will offer at this price, and then we dispatch the generation in the day-ahead. Primarily up here, that is WAPA, and so it's their customers that they serve.
Okay, thank you for that. A lot of emphasis on building out transmission, clearly a huge issue for us in the Western region. Have you got any, we have found, and I think commissioners from a number of states in the West would concur with this observation, that because of the prevalence of federal land in the West, building out transmission is incredibly problematic. Have you got any thoughts about dealing with that challenge as we try and meet those transmission requirements here in the West?
Well, so SPP has that a little bit in our footprint, not nearly as much, obviously, as in the West. I know we've been involved in various levels of discussion or communications about how the federal government can standardize or streamline their processes. Clearly, building transmission is a difficult period, but you certainly hope that the federal government can make it easier or lessen the burden to do that. I mean, we cite transmission, well, we direct that transmission be built, the individual utilities cite it. But ultimately, it's various processes and challenges you have. Obviously, we're not as experienced in federal lands as the West is, but as you point out, it can be a challenge, and we do hear about a lot.
Just one last one. You were talking about the projected change in generation going forward, and you talked about the big three. Do you see any significant prospect for increase of nuclear penetration in that mix?
So I think the industry as a whole is moving in that direction, or a lot more momentum for it. I will say, generation interconnection queue, we do not have any nuclear in it, so nobody is proposing it. But we do see a big shift to solar and batteries in our queue.
Thanks. That's all I had. So let's charge on to plus.
Okay, so the next one. All right, now we're going to move to services in the West. And we're going to talk about there are 3 services we currently provide in the West that we're involved in, and we'll talk about 2 in the West and 2 we're looking at expanding. We're going to talk about Western Resource RC Services Reliability Coordination. So in the yellow in the road, you see the SPP RTO footprint. Electric utilities are required balance reliability coordinating services. So in the yellow, you will see these are the utilities it is required, but is ultimately regulated by FERC. So you get a sense of the number of utilities that have chosen SPP and would provide this service. And again, we started doing this in December 2019. Largely people chose SPP or California, and really those decisions were made after peak reliability no longer existed. And so next we're going to talk about our energy imbalance market. We are operating so there are 2 BOs in them. They're both WAPA balancing utilities that are in the footprint. And so as a result, the utility has extra generation in real time, and a neighboring utility could use and so as a result, this is the second one. This is considered similar to the EIN, the California offers. And also it says we're adding Colorado Springs. I showed slides a couple of weeks dated. Colorado Springs joined our market on August 1st, with USCO, Black Hills, and PRPO to join next year. So the market is growing. Next year, April next year, it's going to almost triple in size to 13.5 gigawatts. So increase interest in that. And this map here shows you those that are taking energy imbalance services in SPP. Any questions about the energy imbalance service that we call WISE?
Questions from commissioners?
Right. Go to RTO West. Actually, a lot of momentum discussions. Actually, the policies have already been approved. And now it is an offering we have for you. Essentially, what it does is it takes our existing RTO footprint and expands it into a Western interconnect. We will optimize the DC ties to bring power between the East and the West in the most economic way possible. We have a number of utilities in 2020, almost 2 years ago, signed letters of commitment to investigate in RTO. And this is a timeline you can see here as we have moved forward. July, the SPP board of directors. So at this point, there will be a first quarter 2023 where individuals can execute a membership of. And then we will begin preparing early part of next year, about this time next year, filing at FERC. And I hope for a FERC approval in early 2024 and actually launch the RTO in 2025. And so it's interesting, Markets Plus gets a lot of attention, but schedule-wise, actually the RTO expansion as West is ahead of that. Map of the utilities that would be joining the ones that have currently signed the letters from the questions about our now we're going to talk about the restoration adequacy program and all that. Would you mind walking through these slides? I will take this. I'll proceed on. So here we have the this slide shows all the various services we're involved in. And for as you all know, the WAP the calculations where they focus on the process and how you do the calculations for resource adequacy. So this is not an SPP program, but we actually have been hired by Western Power to operate that. It's been a great partnership, and we've really got to know the West more, and I think everyone of the participants have got to know SPP more. So this is another service offering we are not offering, but a part of. As you can see from the map here, this map shows the various parts of the Western Interconnect that were involved at some level of services. Questions about before we transition to Markets Plus. All right, we'll keep charging ahead. So now let's talk about Markets Plus, that what we were invited to come speak about. This is a market that SPP is offering into the West. So we'll talk. So as you see with WAP, there's discussion of resource adequacy program in the West. You also see transmission planning, VO consolidation, transmission service provider in the gray. Those are not services that SPP is involved in or offers in. But you see below that, there are a couple of options. EDM is percolating with California offering that. And also SPP, as I showed earlier, we offer the WISE. And I showed you the map of who's a member of the WISE. And then we have the EM that participants, including parts of this state, participate in California. This is what an RTO shows. So as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at expanding the RTO in the West. The commitments early next year. But those in the red are all the functions of an RTO. Montana and the Dakotas, we actually provide all these services. And so this next graph shows, well, what is actually a part of Markets Plus. So Markets Plus would be one of the blue block, and that would be a day-ahead market where we would dispatch the generation of day-ahead in a real-time market, and that would be real-time market with what we offer today with the WISE. And then we would have separate resource adequacy that WAP is taking a look at, and then we have reliability coordinating services that SPP provides. So this is not a full RTO service offering. It is really a market offering to add in addition to the real-time market to do a day-ahead market. So some have asked, well, what does this do for transmission planning? Markets Plus, it is not transmission planning, but what it is just a market. benefit of the market, we will see where the congestion is located. And it certainly can help transmission planners to identify good places to build or enhance transmission on the economic basis. It's important to us, you can see from this slide here, we have areas that we're working on developing. Let's talk about the efforts we're doing on governance. And Kira, if you could,
Hi, can everybody hear me? I still can't really hear everything that's going on there, so I hope this is the right place for me to jump in. I'm going to walk through some of the governance details that we've been working on really hard this last year. Next slide, please. Consistent with SPP's stakeholder-led process, we sought volunteers, potential participants, and other interested stakeholders to help us lead this effort. You'll see those listed there in blue. We had another member, Sarah Edmonds, who was with Portland General at the time we started this effort in January, but as you know, has now become the CEO at Western Power Pool. So she withdrew from the stakeholder leads, but this team has been incredibly helpful to us. You can see the strong support team we have within SPP to facilitate these conversations. But it's been a really great partnership with these stakeholder leads as we've walked through various topics, which I think we're going to summarize on the next slide, please. We have held webinars almost every 2 weeks since January. Again, the stakeholder leads have been instrumental to us in helping us identify how we want to go through this process. Some of this has been education, a lot of discussion about what the West wants in a governance structure. So you can see there the topics. I won't read these for you. Once we got to that first in-person meeting in Phoenix at the end of March, we spent time in breakout sessions developing matrices for different governance options that were on the table. That meeting was incredibly helpful to us to start looking at different options and then being prepared to issue a request for written comments immediately following that meeting. We used a template format so that we'd be able to compile that information fairly quickly in a statistical way. Next slide, please. Once we got those comments in by the 20th, we then issued a straw proposal, which I'll talk about in a minute. A significant part of our process has been a partnership we've had with WEEB, who has facilitated our direct communication with state representatives. On April 13th, we had our first webinar with them, where we really presented what the options were, talked about those discussions in March, what the matrices, and then we got those comments in, and we held a webinar immediately after to summarize those written comments. All of these materials are available on our website. They're extensive, but really can walk you through the process that we followed to date. Next slide, please. So this is the written comment summary we got. You can see here the number of survey respondents that we had. We were very pleased with the input that we had. I think this is 23. Next slide, please. After that, we continued our process. We had another webinar with the state representatives where we really wanted to hear from them. And then we did a webinar on the 23rd when we released our first draft of the governance straw proposal and really walked through that with everyone, the schematic, which we'll talk about in a minute, or maybe we have, and then there's some details about the different components. We then met about a week later. Our second in-person meeting was in Denver. We had separate breakout sessions for the governance discussions to get stakeholder reactions. Next slide, please. Following that, we went through and did a revised straw proposal. Oh, next slide, please. On June 24th, but both of the straw proposals that we've issued to date and the one that we will be issuing soon, version 3.0, really balance these four issues. First and foremost, we have included the consensus views from all of these meetings, written comment opportunities to the maximum extent possible. We want this to be a governance structure for the West by the West. But based on our extensive experience, we also wanted to include and balance what we think FERC will approve. Obviously, our best practices, we've learned a lot in operating an RTO for as long as we have. And then we have to minimize the impacts to SPP Inc. Next slide, please. Important in this discussion is the categories that you see here on your screen, because they're a little bit different than we've done things in the West prior. First would be the markets plus market participant, or MMPs. Those would execute a market a participant agreement, they would contribute generation and or load to the market. We then divide the stakeholder group into two categories. One is the Markets Plus Market stakeholder, or an MMS. They execute a stakeholder agreement. They do not contribute generation or load. They have voting rights on the MIP selection forum, and they're eligible for voting seats on the nominating committee, working groups, and task forces, which are all sector-based, and they pay an annual fee of $5,000. The other category of stakeholders are non-voting. They are, of course, welcome and encouraged to provide input at all stakeholder meetings. They have no voting rights within those entities that we talked about before, but no annual fee. Next slide, please. Here is the schematic that basically walks through the governance structure. At the top, you'll see the SPP Board of Directors, and we're going to walk through each of these in a bit more detail in a moment. And then we've created, based on the input that we received from potential participants and other stakeholders, the need for another independent panel that would be more maybe perhaps West-based, would be the oversight over the Markets Plus. And so we've created the Markets Plus Independent Panel, or the MIP. Below that is the Participants Committee. They would hear any proposal from a working group or a task force. They would decide that. We have voting structures for them. And then their recommendation to pass or fail would go to the MIP. An important committee that I'm sure this commission is interested in is the Markets Plus State Committee. Every state where there is generation or load contributing in the market would have a seat on that. The commission has the authority to appoint the state representative. The representative could come from the governor's office, the state energy office, or the commission. It's really up to each state to decide how they want to staff that. They have their own budget. They are entitled to their own independent staffing if they would like. And the cost for that is socialized across all the participants, not just those that are regulated. In the gray boxes, you'll see the nominating committee for the MIP. That is sector-based. And then it goes up to the MIP selection forum, which is all MMPs and MMSs, which have a vote to appoint those members to the MIP. Next slide, please. We are pursuing an incremental approach for participation in Markets Plus. And so the first phase would be a funded investigation phase. And we'll go through some deadlines, some timelines here at the end, but this we'll be looking for commitments to investigate for Q1 of 2023. There'll be a financial commitment to help us develop the remaining governing documents, the market protocols, and also the FERC tariff, basically what we would file at FERC. Once that is approved, we would then go into phase 2, which is implementation. There'd be a separate financial commitment for full integration into the Markets Plus market. Next slide, please. All right, let's walk through a few of the details of the various components of the governance structure. The board of directors would have the ultimate oversight, but they would give significant recognition to the Markets Plus panel when those decisions are made. There are a few things that would have to go to the board of directors, and you can see those listed here. I won't go into those in details, but basically anything that has a material impact on SPP. As Paul mentioned, this is a contract service, so those participants are in a contractual relationship with the SPP board. So any material change to that participant agreement would have to go to the board as they are a signatory to that agreement. Any debt issuances, staffing impacts, etc., because those fall to the to SPP Inc. would be necessary to go to the board. Next slide, please. However, the MIP would be the highest level of authority within the Markets Plus governance structure, comprised of 5 people. 1 would be an SPP independent director, and that person would serve as chair. 4 would be approved through that selection form that I mentioned earlier. You can see there some of the requirements that we have. We're looking at a 4-year term, no term limits, but initial terms would have to be staggered, obviously, as you're setting up this board. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, they're the highest level of authority. Actions taken by the MIP that don't require SPP board review would be filed at FERC pursuant to Section 205 of the Federal Power Act. So that's significant authority for the MIP. The appeals any MIP member can appeal to the board for additional review, but only members of the MIP can appeal those. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, this is the MIP nominating committee, sector-based. Right now it's 10 sectors. SPP had no input at all on these lists. During that first opportunity for comments, we asked respondents what sectors they would like to see on the nominating committee, and if someone mentioned it, we put it here. We have since had several conversations and discussions in breakout sessions, certainly in Portland most recently, about refining this list a little bit, that maybe it didn't quite fit what we were looking to do. So you'll see some refinement here in version 3.0. The election process is spelled out in the straw proposals, and it really mirrors the SPP Board of Directors process, because we have found that that works well. And then again, voting rights for all participants and Markets Plus stakeholders at this election forum. Next slide, please. The Markets Plus Executive Committee is comprised of each participant's representative. You can see there the requirements that they be senior level and have financial decision-making authority. And then really the MPEC does two things. One, they make recommendations to the MIP on proposals coming to them from the working groups, but they also establish working groups and task forces. So they have two important areas of authority. The voting structure has been one of interesting discussion. We started out with this House and Senate sort of notion, but it appears the most recent discussions really are going to a unicameral approach. The question is whether that would be a 2-sector or 3-sector and how you might weight those. So those discussions continue. SPP is going to have to land on one of those proposals where we just don't have consensus around. It's pretty evenly split right now on the dialogue that we're hearing. So you'll see that in version 3.0. Next slide, please. We've talked a little bit about the working groups and task forces. This is very similar to how it works within the RTO. That's really where the hard work is done. The MPEC can establish those, as I mentioned. They would be comprised of participants and stakeholders. The MPEC chair would appoint those after a solicitation process, simple majority voting structure for those. Next slide, please. Again, the Markets Plus State Committee, and that first bullet point isn't exactly right. It should say 1 representative. I'm sorry that I didn't catch that. That's a change between the May and June drafts. The commission will appoint that representative. They can provide advice on all things to the MIP and MEC. They have very strong, or MPEC, they have very strong authority there. During this next phase, phase 1, is where we will help facilitate the conversations with the states to develop their own charter, which would include their meeting schedule, voting structure. As I mentioned, they would have the ability to do some independent funding. Next slide, please. Consistent with the SPP model, each working group, committee, et cetera, would be staffed by an SPP staff secretary. We are non-voting, independent, and impartial. We don't have any votes. Again, stakeholder-led, not staff-led. Administrative role of keeping minutes, discussions, et cetera, and then advising the MIP and the MPEC of any budgetary impacts related to various things are going on within those committees or working groups. Next slide, please. The governance review, we've put in 2 components at this point, no later than every 3 years after the launch. But we also wanted to put in a guardrail of the MPEC being able to request that. The scenario that has come up here is that perhaps certain participants in Markets Plus might choose to move to the RTO, and that would change the dynamic and the makeup of the Markets Plus market. So at that point, they'd want to revisit the governance to see who was going to be remaining and determine whether changes were needed to respond to that. Next slide, please. All right, as I mentioned, we did that first draft on May 23rd. Our second one came on June 24th. Next slide, please. A few things that we did, some general cleanup. As any of you have been involved in document preparation, you look at it 100 times and you think you've caught everything, but there were a few typos that we needed to clean up, so we did that. I'm not going to walk through these specifics, but you'll have these slides as a reference document and you can see where we've made some changes, clarification of appeals, some things on the MPEC. So you can look at those and see the differences. On June 24th, we issued both a clean version and a redline version, so it was easy for folks to see where we've made changes. Next slide, please. Again, and maybe that first slide was correct. The change in the June straw proposal at the MSC was changing commissioner to representative, changed some things related to the working group. And then on the appeals section, importantly, we added the MSC to any appeal rights. So not only MPs and MMSs, but both the state committee can also appeal both to the MPEC or to the MIP. Next slide, please. I think we've covered this slide. It was an important change requested by the states. Next slide, please. Appeals process, I sort of covered this already. We've added the MSC. We only had addressed appeals to the MPEC, and we wanted to add the ability to appeal MPEC decisions to the MIP. So that was another change in the June draft. Next slide, please. After we got version 2.0 out, we asked for comments. This time we did not use a template. Instead, we requested that respondents tell us anything and everything about the proposal. And so next slide, please. We were pleased to see we did a webinar just a week later on the 22nd of July to summarize those comments. We had a similarly broad and diverse response. 21 entities provided significant comment to us on these various things. Next slide. Because it was on anything and everything, these are really the main topics that we've compiled those into so that we could sort of gather the total feedback on issues, even though no one followed the same format. So things have been really divided into these issues so that we could respond to them in our follow-up discussions. Next slide, please. So then we were in Portland a couple of weeks ago where we had additional breakout sessions. Next slide, please. We really tried to take the remaining issues from that comment and focus in and have some additional discussion. So we had 3 separate breakout sessions. Each session was an hour and a half. So another 4.5 hours dedicated to governance discussions. The first session was our initial reaction to comments, and we were really fortunate to have 4 of our officers in the room for that. Our CEO, Barbara Sugg, our COO, Lanny, and then Paul and Bruce were also there. And so all 4 of them got to really have a dialogue with interested stakeholders and potential participants about some of the things that they found in their comments, and we were able to get some feedback going there. We spent our second session really focused on the MPEC, its voting structure mostly, but some other issues there that we heard in comments. And then our last session was focused on sector representation, both on the nominating committee and the working groups, and some good discussion there. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to take any questions on this phase of the presentation.
Commissioners?
We'll transition to next steps. What are the next steps for Mark? Step 1 and step 2. So we're getting feedback and ideas on the proposed service offering. And so at this point, SPP is briefings to explain it. And then at that point, we will find out who's committed. Actually, Bonneville Power Administration has committed to be a part of phase 1 to further investigate. We have received a letter from a number of utilities from Arizona up to the Northwest that said they're interested, as well as in Colorado, they're interested in being a part of Markets Plus to go to phase 1. And then ultimately, the final step will, 2 steps will be the board approval of the service offering, and then a filing at FERC, and then to launch it. So that's where we're at. We're transitioning hopefully soon from steps 1 and 2 and start moving to step 3. Have a draft service offering at the end of next. So that SPP can work with the stakeholders to develop it, get everything approved, and then filed at FERC for approval. So that concludes our presentation today. Again, thank you for the invitation to come out and present, give you an update not on SPP and what we're doing in the West, but also on Markets Plus offering.
I talked about the importance of ease of entry and withdrawal from the market. Talk to me a little bit about what you envision that looking like with Markets Plus.
Certainly, the way we have how the financing of the cost of Markets Plus is to be structured hadn't been decided. Again, we would work with the stakeholders to decide it. I will tell you how we conducted WISE. So there's a startup cost to be involved, or there's a cost to join WISE, our energy imbalance service market. And so you join and you agree to pay off those costs over a number of years. If you leave before that set number of years, there's an exit fee. But if you don't leave within that set number of years and you stay beyond that, then as a result, you can continue and leave with no cost to withdraw. It could be developed when you pay the cost up front, but the way the market participants, at least one for WISE, spread out those costs for the first few years. Then after that, there would be no exit fee.
Was WISE an alternative available when Northwestern decided to join the EIM?
I'll admit, I don't know the timing of it, of them joining the EIM.
From a practical standpoint, are there either policy or physical infrastructure barriers that you all have identified with regard to Montana utilities moving into the SPP family?
Yeah, ultimately, what we do is their connectivity that they can connect to the market. Obviously, there's several states or several transmission lines alone that inhibits it. So ultimately, it'll determine on who joins. And if they join, whether or not it is capable of joining the market, and then whether or not they want to pursue that. My understanding, and maybe the answer better than I, but some of the utilities in the state view both markets plus and EDM as viable options and open to pursue whichever one works out best.
Is there any, I believe I'm correct in observation that the South Dakota Northwestern Energy Operation, in fact, is a participant in SPP there, correct?
Correct.
Does that have any kind of benefit that would carry over to their entry in Montana?
I think one would be experience and understand of how the process works, whether it is a stakeholder process, the state's engagement, or just how the market functions. Obviously, the help ease over if you're already knowledgeable to the existing market, then it would make sense as you move over, easier transition. If you take a look at the utilities that are currently planning to join or committed to explore joining the RTO in the West, Tri-State, WAPA, and Basin, there are current members on the East. So it's been an easy transition for them.
Well, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. This certainly has been enlightening for me, and I appreciate having the opportunity to kind of see this side by side with Cal ISO. Be anxious to see this rollout continue, and if there are no other questions, then with our thanks, we'll adjourn this meeting. One last chance for anybody that has any questions. All right, Paul, Lee, thank you all very much. Kara, thank you. And thank you all for being here. And we are adjourned.
Thanks for having us.